Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, October 10, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week on the show, Nick Seebruch sits down with Inori Roy, the co-founder of Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine, to discuss why many journalists in Canada remain hesitant to cover Palestine. They explore how the organization is helping newsrooms report on Gaza with greater fairness and accuracy, and the broader efforts underway to promote ethical journalism across the country. Here are Inori Roy and Nick Seebruch in conversation. Take a listen.
Inori, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine?
Of course. So CJJP was founded with the aim of being able to speak truth to power about what's happening both in Palestine with regards to Israel's genocide and its onslaught, but also with regards to what's happening in Canadian media. The complicity of most media outlets, especially mainstream media outlets, in functionally erasing the war crimes and genocidal actions of the Israeli army, of treating the press as a mouthpiece for Israeli propaganda, and for failing to acknowledge the scale of the tragedy and the complicity of Canada in that tragedy. We wanted to be able to create an environment where journalists could act in solidarity with Palestinian journalists, could speak to the infringement against the rights of reporters everywhere to be able to do their job and to report on the truth, and to highlight that Canadian media has a chronic problem with naming the perpetrator. And so in that capacity, we joined together. There are lots of members of the organization who are public. There are also members of the organization who are from some of these mainstream newsrooms and can't speak out and only work privately or under the radar because they know that they'd be punished for being part of something that is essentially a press freedom exercise and activity and organization. So we wanted a place for journalists to be able to work in solidarity towards those causes. And we're quite new. We were only founded earlier this summer. And so it's been only a little while so far, but we're hoping that we can be effective in making our presence known and providing a refuge for journalists who are concerned about this, and also in pushing newsrooms to do better.
Absolutely. And in terms of pushing newsrooms to do better, can you go a little bit more into some of the examples of problems that you've seen with reporting from Canadian journalists on what's happening in Gaza, on the genocide? Is obviously something that, as of today, we've been covering for 2 years now. So can you tell us a little bit about how coverage of this story has been treated and how it's evolved over the past 2 years?
Of course. So we've seen all of the problems that are commonly talked about when it comes to media complicity in matters of oppression sort of across the board. We see a universal reliance on passive voice, right? In the same way that news outlets have reported on police violence previously, or colonial violence as being, a person was shot or a person was arrested, as opposed to police did the shooting. In the same way, now you see Gaza is bombed or Gaza is starved, as opposed to acknowledging who is doing the starving and the bombing. So that is one of the sort of fundamental issues. And this matter of, it's such a clear violation of journalism standards, because we know that journalism generally never uses the passive voice. The passive voice is something that editors will frequently rail against, except when it comes to issues like this. So there's the matter of which sources they choose to use. You so rarely see Palestinian voices forefronted in coverage of the region, but you often see voices from the Israeli Defense Forces and Israeli government officials. You often see voices from Zionist organizations organizations who claim to speak on behalf of the entire Jewish community when there is a sizable population of the Jewish community in Canada who are opposed to the Israeli government's actions and who are trying to speak out in favor of peace, and who are being overshadowed by organizations who have a strictly pro-Israel stance and who treat any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. And those voices are forefronted more often than any other in mainstream media, which is an injustice to the Jewish community as much as any other. You see significant reduction over time in reporting on the scale of protest, the scale of dissent against the genocide and the war. More and more people are realizing the extent of the damage and the harm resulting from the genocide, and yet the news coverage would make it seem like it's become an issue of the past. And so across the board, when there is coverage, who's being covered, how it's being covered, and whether it's being covered or not. These are some of the issues that we see taking place. And we also know that inside newsrooms, journalists are being silenced, are being alienated and isolated and told off for doing their jobs and for trying to speak up about Palestine and pushing for better coverage in their newsrooms. We know that there are journalists who have left their outlets because they can no longer live with the complicity that they're being forced into by their editors. We know that there are journalists who desperately are trying to make a change on the inside and are being thwarted at every level by upper management or by the threat of funders pulling out. And so there is a genuine effort to silence conversations about Palestine in Canadian newsrooms and in newsrooms that ostensibly are fairly progressive or considered progressive outwardly, at least. And so the scale, it penetrates every level of reporting, from what it's like in the newsroom to what's reported on and what's not.
And I'm glad that you brought that up about the issue of the passive voice, because it might be something that someone who didn't train in journalism or worked in journalism doesn't quite understand the significance of. But for those of us who are journalists and been trained as journalists, it is something very significant, especially in an age of Donald Trump calling media fake news and attacking news credibility, where it is something that journalists take quite seriously. Being unbiased, being meeting professional standards. So to see things like the use of the passive voice in this case is really stark for those within the industry, and the conformity to the use of the passive voice and other issues in that reporting. Is that journalists policing themselves for fear of backlash, or is that coming from corporate masters, advertisers, funders, pressures from people outside of the profession?
Well, it's a good question, because when it becomes a chilling effect of this nature, when you see the problem take place at every level, you start to realize that, maybe at first it was about someone from up top, a manager, sort of sending down some kind of decree on, we don't use the word Palestine in our coverage, for example. But over time, we know that it also has an effect on, it wears down what a journalist is capable of doing, right? So if, 5 times out of 10, it is a corporate manager or a funder or the the member of the board who is, in charge of fundraising, who says that, we can't have coverage of this nature because of its incendiary political potential, or because it seems biased, or what have you, the sort of myriad excuses that we use instead of openly saying, well, this makes Israel look bad. 5 times out of 10, if that comes down the chain and trickles into how an editor edits a story, then the next 3 times out of 10, you'll also have the writers start to be like, all right, if I include these words in a story, I'm going to be worn down. I know I'm going to face the same battle again, so I might as well just not include it at all. And then the last 2 times out of 10, the writer will be like, well, I don't really want to report on the subject anymore, because, I know it's not going to get anywhere. I'm going to be stuck in an editorial process forever. I'm going to, look bad in front of my bosses because I'll be seen as a troublemaker for pushing back against this. So it becomes this really profound, really ingrained chilling effect, where it starts up top and then it starts to affect how journalists sees their job, sees their role in an organization, sees their future in the industry. And then that journalist comes to a crossroads where they say, well, I can either never write for this publication again if I'm a freelancer, or I can choose to quit if I work there as a staff, or I be quiet and I don't say anything about this, and I secretly have a problem with it, but I never bring that up to my bosses. And then ultimately I take my paycheck home and I have a stable job, but at what cost to my moral character or to the quality of my work? And this is why really early on, it's crazy how long this has been happening, but really early on, in January 2024, when we had a vigil for the journalists who were killed. Up until that point, we talked about the fact that this was what journalists in Canadian newsrooms were going through was a form of moral injury. Moral injury being a circumstance in which the system forces you not to do your job properly, not to meet your moral standards properly, because you will be punished so severely. And in a scarcity mindset and a scarcity atmosphere like the Canadian journalism scene, losing a job, it doesn't mean that there's a possibility you'll never get another one, or at least that's what we're told and what we're reminded, in order to make us hyper conscious and hyper careful about the way we operate in news spaces. But over time, that sort of it builds up into an inability or forced inability to meet the moral standard of your work. And that is a serious workplace concern. It's a serious concern for journalistic freedoms. And it's a self-policing that becomes deeply harmful for your psyche and your conscience. And some reporters feel that very acutely. Others, I believe, have probably just blocked themselves off from it. And so that's why some people seem so comfortable with, sleeping at night, despite their irresponsible reporting.
Also, I just wanted to talk about outside pressures, because I'm not sure if this is something that you've seen, but I know here at Rabble, we have seen a dramatic increase in requests from writers. We're a publication that's almost 25 years old. So we've had a lot of writers throughout history, and all of our stuff is online. It's all searchable. And we've had freelance journalists, just people who wrote op-eds for us in the past. We've seen increasing requests for that content to be taken down, especially if it's related to Israel and seen as being controversial. Are these stories that you've heard as well, that people are feeling afraid to write about it due to outside consequences, outside threats?
Absolutely. Some of the most targeted threats come from organizations like Honest Reporting Canada, which is an organization with charitable status whose I can't speak to what their official mandate is, but it seems like one of their primary modes of operation is to repeatedly harass and spotlight journalists who have been reporting responsibly on Palestine. They frequently target reporters who manage to include, mentions of the war and the genocide in their reporting, or who report positively on Palestinian art or culture or history. And that is fundamentally, and it's an infringement on the journalists' rights. It's an infringement on press freedom and on the truth. But it is also a surprisingly effective force among editors. Editors are really afraid of getting an email from Honest Reporting, or getting an email from Honest Reporting's followers, of which there are many. I believe that the way they work is to send out sort of action alerts, which indicate that particular reporters should be frequently harassed, or reporters' editors should be reached out to and told about what the reporter's been up to on social media, even if the editor is very well aware. And out of fear of, being the subject of that harassment or targeting, editors will police their reporters preemptively, right? And so we know that organizations like Honest Reporting Canada make it a lot harder to do your job in reporting well on Palestine, reporting responsibly and fairly on Palestine. So I think that question of what are the outside influences and why do they have such influence? I think part of what's so interesting is that I don't think for any other issue we would let an outside influence have such power over how we shape our editorial content. There is a sort of fundamental dehumanization of Palestine and a valorization of Israel and the Israeli government and the army in newsrooms and in mainstream newsrooms that is, it sets up journalists, even from a very young age, to know that I will never be able to report peacefully on this thing because I will be targeted. When we had an open letter that went up at the same time as the vigil last January, where we specifically talked about, this solidarity that Canadian journalists had with Palestinian journalists who were being killed, the demand for Canadian newsrooms to do better and to not be complicit. And we had 300 signatories, and Honest Reporting put out a press release about our letter in which they specifically picked photos of some of the youngest signatories. We had some signatories who were either Toronto Star interns or former interns who had just recently become part of the industry, very early career people, mostly racialized people. And also a lot of Muslim and Arab sounding names. And Honest Reporting, out of 300 signatories, I believe it was 200 when we started, and 300 by the sort of peak of the signing. But out of 200 signatories, Honest Reporting picked the images of sort of 4 or 5 signatories who were sort of scattered throughout the list, because I was the second name on the list and my photo was not there. And it was specifically, it seemed specifically to be, I don't know how to describe it except that it came across to me personally like there was an intent in going after the most vulnerable reporters who had put their names on the list. And it's really concerning that from such a young age, reporters are being targeted for setting some kind of moral boundary in their work or in their presence in the industry. And it really makes you wonder about what will that young journalist do the next time they're at a moral crossroads like this. Will they feel safe to be able to speak their truth?
Absolutely. The threats that Canadian journalists are facing are real and oppressive, having a chilling effect on the industry. Also, in a way, pales in comparison to what the threats that Palestinian journalists on the ground are facing. We're speaking today on October 7th, the second year anniversary of the start of the war. And in 2024, on the second anniversary of the start of the war in Ukraine, there have been less than 20 journalists who've been killed covering that conflict. Today, on the second anniversary of the war in Gaza, the genocide, it's well over 200 journalists who have been killed, it's estimated. And just what are the conversations happening within your organization? You mentioned the visual you did in 2024, but what are some of the other conversations you're having about the effect on the industry that this rate of attack on journalists specifically in the war is having?
Well, there's a lot that we'd like to be able to do. We're a relatively young organization, and there's a lot that we have planned as our membership grows. We're currently 50 members plus, and we really want to meet the urgency of the moment. There is a sense of what can we do not only to be able to address this egregious crime, this egregious war crime and a violation of the sort of very fundamental human principle of the right to report, and also what can we do to create long-standing change, so we can put out statements and press releases and hold press conferences to be able to shine a light on the scale of the problem right now and Canada's complicity in it. We can try to hold newsrooms accountable, to work with news workers unions, to be able to try and have some kind of change in how newsrooms operate from the inside. But how can we make long-standing change as well? Because of course, it's been 2 years of genocide. It's been, decades and decades of settler colonialism and violence. And Canadian media's complicity has gone on so much longer than just the last 2 years as well, right? And so those are the questions we're trying to figure out right now. When we talk about what can we put out for October 7th to be able to speak to fellow media workers who still remain silent, even though it's so clear that we have crossed any sort of last moral boundary, right? We've crossed, like, any line that we could have drawn has been crossed in what's happened. And if you don't speak up now, it's likely you probably never will, because I don't know what more needs to happen for you to speak up. And so, in part of our thinking when we were trying to figure out what our messaging would be for October 7th, of which there's discussion about whether is there a way to reach newsrooms, to be able to reach journalists and tell them to be responsive. But there was also a sense that I don't know if we can. I think we've reached everybody who will feasibly say something, and if they choose not to say something now, no amount of convincing from us will do anything. So there's a constant sort of push and pull in trying to figure out where our efforts can be most effective, who we can reasonably sway, at this point. And I don't have a lot of concrete answers right now because we move between sort of, responsiveness, like being responsive to being able to create a reporting guide on how to report on any of the ceasefire agreements that happen in the next few weeks, and how to a reporting guide on what not to say about October 7th, right? Like don't say that all of this started on October 7th, 2023, because it's gone on so much longer than that. There are ways that we can put out guides, but there's also a question of, we're all volunteers. No one's being paid for this work. We're all doing it alongside our day jobs as journalists. And sometimes there is a genuine doubt about whether our efforts will be well spent trying to reach journalists who are sometimes seemingly immovable. So I know that we're balancing, working with unions and with other writers organizations to be able to make moves within the industry. I know we're also working to make our presence known in the community, to make non-journalists know that our efforts are being put towards a freer and more open media landscape around Palestine. But it's really hard to know what exactly the right move or the most necessary move in any moment is, because sometimes it feels like we're up against a sort of massive Goliath of a system that is unwielding.
Absolutely. And, just in the few minutes we have left, I do want to talk about one of your recent efforts to raise awareness. It was the Toronto Palestinian Film Festival, which was last week in Toronto, of course. And one of the events that you were involved with involved virtual reality headsets. And I just want to let our audience know, as a bit of professional disclosures, that my partner is the owner of the company that provided the headsets. So can you tell me a little bit about the film festival and what you guys were up to there?
Yes, so we did a VR pop-up exhibit in association with the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy. So they are an organization based in Palestine, and they run these virtual reality sessions in which people can get to see on the ground footage from different parts of Palestine. So places like Rafah and Khan Yunis and Gaza, but also, the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, different parts of the West Bank. And the goal is to be able to give people as immersive as possible an experience of what life is like on the ground in Palestine, both the immense scale of the destruction in Gaza and also the scale of the sort of everyday casual oppression in occupied territory. And it was a beautiful experience. So basically, we set up a little booth in the lobby of the TIFF Lightbox, and we, people who are coming in to see Toronto Palestine Film Festival programming, they stopped by the booth, they tried the VR headset. It was 5 minutes a turn, and it basically gave people this really intimate look at what life is like on the ground. There were tours from Palestinian journalists and social media personalities like Bisan, who everybody sort of knew and recognized. People came away from it incredibly emotional. We had, people who had never sort of seen anything on that scale or who had only seen it on the news. We also had people who were from Gaza and Jerusalem, and who were extremely emotional, knowing that this sort of immersive 5 minute experience was one of the few ways they would actually be able to go back in some sense, And so there was a young Palestinian woman who told us that her father had been born in Jerusalem, and that the VR experience of getting a tour of Damascus Gate was the closest she would be able to get anytime soon to being able to go back to her father's homeland and to her homeland. And so it was incredibly successful. And I was nervous because I thought in some sense it would be considered facile, like, oh, like you're showing me a video on a headset. But it really moved people in a way that I was so glad for. And it was a way to show the community that, there are journalists who care. Like, we're not all sitting silent and complicit. We are moved, and we're trying to do something about it.
Inori Roy, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Nick. Thank you so much.
That was Inori Roy and Nick Seebruch in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Inori and Nick. To learn more about the work Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine does, visit cjjp.org. Switching gears now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. To do that, let's turn things back over to Rabble editor Nick Seebruch. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting this week with labor news. At time of reporting, Alberta's teachers continue to be on strike in the largest teacher strike in the province's history. The Alberta Teachers Association, which represents public, Catholic, and Francophone teachers in the province, walked off the job on Monday after failing to reach an agreement through negotiations with the Teachers Employer Bargaining Association. The bargaining association, in turn, issued a lockout notice to the union, a sign that both sides remain far apart in negotiations. One roadblock hindering talks, according to the union, is their employer's refusal to negotiate on issues like class sizes, class complexity, and support for students, something the province says is inaccurate. In response to the work disruption, Premier Danielle Smith's government has floated the idea of paying parents to homeschool their children. The union says it remains available for further negotiations. Staying with labor news, Quebec English language dubbing voice directors have signed their first collective agreement. The agreement sees pay for these workers standardized at $85 an hour, and is set to rise by more than 10% in the next 4 years. English dubbing voice directors are represented by the Alliance of Canadian Cinema, Television and Radio Artists, or ACTRA, and they say that this deal provides support and protection for an industry that often goes unnoticed. ACTRA Montreal president Simon Peacock said this agreement was long awaited for performers who have been calling for better protections for 2 decades, saying, quote, "Our voice directors and our voice performers, between the two of them, are the talent that makes this such a well-regarded industry throughout the world. It was kind of ridiculous to us that the directors, the ones that have the artistic control of this product, weren't actually being acknowledged in a way that was reasonable." End quote. And finally, Prime Minister Mark Carney has promised to boost the country's economic development by pursuing so-called nation-building projects. Many of these projects, however, disregard the requirement to consult Indigenous communities, as well as the environmental consequences that these projects will have. These projects include things like liquid natural gas and oil pipelines, and nuclear reactors. In a recent column on Rabble, Ole Hendrickson says that people, not profits, should guide Canada's development, saying, quote, "Let's not let pursuit of economic gain jeopardize Canada's natural wealth. Let's put people and nature ahead of corporate profits." End quote. And as always, you can read about all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Nierenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.